So for this week's teleseminar, we decided to tackle a rather deeper, more complex topic, which is the rise of alternative currencies, which explicitly Bitcoin as one manifestation, I think provides a great kind of convergence point between some of the stuff we talk about in terms of social capital, in terms of social economy, in terms of reputation, and the way that it is increasingly becoming a conscious aspect of our online activities. But yet a parallel track to all of this is actual currency, actual things you can buy and sell with. And Bitcoin is one that seems to have a trajectory that's quite considerable, that it's growing at a rate that represents both the volatility I think it has, but also, again, to come back to this notion of it's difficult to understand. I mean, it's one of these internet phenomena that I think just attracts the curious. Because, on the surface, I have to admit, the reason I wanted to do today's seminar as a kind of interview format is even though I've been reading a ton of material on it, I'm not sure I fully understand how Bitcoin works. So let's start this off on a basic level, and we'll do it as a kind of back and forth. But Ken, why don't you start us off with what is Bitcoin and what is it about it that attracted you?
So Bitcoin is a virtual currency. It's online only. It's just basically a bunch of encrypted numbers is basically what it comes down to. But these numbers all have to match each other, and the only way to match two numbers up is through doing the same type of encryption that protects your banking session on the internet. And that is only safe because the calculations to break it are incredibly hard. So what they've done is they've actually made it slightly easier than the bank encryption, but you just have to trial and error through trillions of numbers to find it. Now that would be if you only had one laptop and it was you running, it would take you a million years to find it. But what's happened is that there's hundreds of thousands of people at this point. The difficulty is increasing in finding these coins, and it takes the whole network.
But the idea is just like traditional currency that would have a unique number. Each of these coins has a unique number.
Yes.
That's been generated essentially using strong encryption.
Right, so but it's not like number 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're not in order. It's like numbers that are like
crazy random,
200 digits long.
Right.
And there's 6 million in circulation now. So out of a possible 200 digits long, that's an incredibly small amount. You can't just guess one because it just wouldn't be valid.
And because of the encryption, each one can be verified. So it's not like you could make one up and make up a crazy string of letters and say, here's my Bitcoin.
No, it's verifiable. It's easy to verify, but very hard to generate. So to generate one that makes the verification work is very, very hard.
And why is it hard to generate? Just because there isn't enough computational power?
Well, the way that it was designed is that it's like all currencies are, and a lot of people that I've talked to recently, and I'm going to actually get out of my depth, so I'm going to rely on people who are a little better read than I am in terms of economic and monetary political theory. All currencies in the world are by fiat. The only reason that we agree that a $5 Canadian bill or American bill is worth $5 is because we all agree on it. And we figure that even if you don't agree on it, I can take it to someone else and they'll probably agree on it. And they'll probably agree it's worth $5.02 or $4.98, something like that. We're pretty sure that no one's going to say, thanks for your $100 bill, I'll count that as a 20. We all know that the American dollar, so far, before it collapses. Now, other currencies, of course, have collapsed. And that's where people say, no, your $100 is worth 20 today, and you have incredible, that's inflation.
But this is the idea of an internet currency. That's not tied to a national government. That's not tied to the policies of a particular government, but tied just to computational resources.
Well, let me get into that. So the way they did it is if you create a virtual currency online that's just created by fiat, people can just say, okay, I created another $200 for myself. I printed some money. In some circles, we call that quantitative easing too, which is also known as printing money, which is what the US government is doing right now. But you can't just do that because the way that it's a peer-to-peer network and the way that it is set up is such that these coins all have to match the cryptographic signatures. And it's very, very hard to match a coin to its cryptographic signature. You have to generate both sides of it. One side's very easy for the verification, everybody can use it. The other side's very, very hard for it to be generated. So what they did when they started is they had a couple hundred computers or maybe at most participants, and they made the difficulty so that coins would always be generated about 50 Bitcoin dollars, for whatever that's worth, not necessarily American dollar, Canadian dollar, they just call them Bitcoin dollars. 50 Bitcoin dollars would be generated about every 10 minutes by the network. And what happens is the peer-to-peer network measures the output of the network to make sure that if people calculate it in 9.2 minutes, it's a little too fast. And if that happens successively over several iterations, eventually after a few days, it'll see the rates getting faster and faster. The whole network will dynamically recalculate and say, all right, we're making the coin calculation a little bit harder to make it take 10 minutes instead of 8.5.
And what do you mean by the network? Like
it's a peer-to-peer network.
So literally everyone runs their own little client
Yep.
that contributes to the larger generation of the currency.
Well, there's
does that
two parts of it. There's the wallet, which just allows you to speak peer-to-peer to the network and just transmit and receive messages and be part of the network. I run one. I don't have the right equipment to calculate coins. I'll get into that later. But I just run one just to keep the network alive.
And by wallet, I mean this is literally a digital wallet. It's what stores your Bitcoins.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's connected in real time to the Bitcoin marketplace.
Yes, it is. It's sending back and forth all the communications that people are sending and trading blocks to say, I see this new coin has come on the market. Everybody start verifying it and make sure it's real. Everybody starts verifying. The whole network talks to each other, and this side says I verified, that side says I verified, and you actually wait and you can see how long. You can follow this off. It's totally auditable. The whole thing is in the clear. Everybody can see. Each coin is signed by the next person who's verified it, so you can see all the people who have verified the coin, and you can see that if there's trust been broken, if you have the right tools, it'll be a lot of research, but they're writing tools now to go through that audit trail. This is beyond what modern currency would ever have attached, and the U.S. government, I'll try to remember to say it later, would love this stuff because there's a paper trail, literally, or like bit trail, that goes all the way back to the creation of that dollar.
Well, let's take a tangent there. I mean, some of the hype that's been associated with Bitcoin is that it's anonymous. But perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps it's quite the opposite, that it's an online currency. It's an autonomous currency, but it is very much subject to surveillance, subject to tracking, because of the transparency of every single transaction that's used with any element of the currency.
Right, but of course your identifying marks are not on the dollars, and you don't sign your name on it. The only thing that governments could do, and I'm sure they do, they already do this with all your email and everything else, so they sniff your packets at your ISP, and there's a Canadian bill on the shelf, which I'm hoping we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks, talking about ISPs requiring to surveil their customers. So with enough access points and network points, since the traffic is encrypted, the coins themselves are encrypted, but which coins you're sending to each other is not encrypted. I can see you sent coin, whatever, 200 digit long. I can see the identifier. I can see it went from this guy at this IP to this guy. Actually, you can't see who received it. The only person who can receive it is the person who can unlock, because each coin when it's so there's, let me get into transactions for a second. Transactions are done by broadcasting it onto the network. You say, I give this coin away to this secret number. Now, no one knows who has the opening key for the closing key of the secret number. All people see is the locking key. There's two keys.
But it's a public act. It's like you're in this big,
it's completely public.
Big safety deposit box room, and you tell everybody, I'm about to put a coin into this safety deposit box.
Whoever has the key.
But no one knows who actually has the key to that safety deposit box.
Right. And you can't just watch it and see who unlocks it, because everybody gets that broadcast, and they can keep it for years and not act on it, not do anything with it. There's no unlocking. The only time it's unlocked is when it gets sent to the next person. So everybody just receives it. The only time, nothing ever happens to it. So you can't see the unlocking action. The only time it ever has to be unlocked is when, say, if I got a coin from someone else, if I keep it for 2 years and then I give it to you, the only way that you would know is I have to unlock it to allow your key. For me to send it to your key, I have to unlock it and lock it with yours. And that's the only time it ever happens. So it can be very, very difficult. It's an incredibly hard computation project for the government, even with all their network surveillance. It's possible. And you can just overlay this on top of stuff like Tor, which is an anonymous proxy.
Well, and that's the sort of news example that came up around this site Silk Road, which is a marketplace for illegal narcotics that uses Tor, which is the anonymization software, and then Bitcoin as the currency for these drug deals.
Right.
And I mean, it's interesting that article ends by saying exactly what we're discussing. That law enforcement could, at the source, monitor the hashtag, monitor the digital fingerprint, as it were, and track that to the Bitcoin transaction to prove that someone made the purchase.
Yeah.
But could you speculate a little on what other applications you could see of this currency?
Oh, I can see lots. I was just listening right now to the radio. Actually, it's so topical. I should have messaged you because it's such an excellent talk. It was Bill Moyers talking to Boston University. It was on alternative radio on CUT, which I just happened to turn on and it accompanied my drive. Excellent talk about how this is so germane to our topic, about how the banking industry has fixed the market and got their bailouts and everything else by control and manipulation of currency, by having captured Congress and they run the federal banks, the Federal Reserves. So it's very germane. And then at the end of the program, they said, if you'd like to make a donation, blah, blah, blah. I was like, you know what? I would happily pay $1 or $2 to have listened to this. And they say, call this number, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh man, I'm driving on a pen, blah, blah, blah. I can't sit here and do this. If I had an iPhone app, and I do text in the car a little bit, I admit, I could just, if they gave a hash of some kind, I could just send them a coin really easily from my iPhone or my smartphone or whatever.
So this is where it brings in, the broader mobile commerce. I mean, Google Wallet was announced this week, sort of Google's attempt to, I think, maybe not prematurely, but try to accelerate that shift towards people thinking about digital commerce devices, digital transactional devices, and the smartphone as that type of payment.
Well, that's kind of funny because Korea, South Korea, and Sweden, where's Nokia?
Finland
have been doing that for ever, right? And you can do it in Germany and Denmark and all that, right? We're always the last. It's because we always have these giant silos that are oligopolies set up, and they're huge, and they're incredibly lumbering. They have a lot of momentum. Once they start moving in one direction, you can't turn it around.
It's not just that, though. I think it's also the North American consumer and their sort of propensity.
The last 40 years of giant industries.
But also their propensity or fantasy to personal liberty. That I think for a lot of people, certainly the feedback I've been getting from the Google Wallet stuff I did on CBC, was people are terrified of being tracked. People are terrified.
Well, that's great
of having that information. But I don't want to get into the popular sentiment. I'm more interested.
Well, that's very important.
I'm more interested though in the technology and the relationship between these types of mobile commerce applications that come from Google, that come from Visa in terms of their digital wallet, and how that compares to Bitcoin, and whether Bitcoin is going to be a disruptive force. That, say, if it starts, people on Twitter start, using those same Bitcoin hashes for charity drives, for fundraising drives.
That'd be great.
As a way to get people interested in the currency.
That'd be awesome.
I mean, elaborate a bit on the type of disruption that could occur in terms of how it plays out against the broader, Google and so on attempts to achieve the same thing.
I think there's so many unknowns. It's just speculation that I see 5 sci-fi novels. Even if you just think, if you turn off your typical kind of, how should I put it, your limiting kind of thoughts that you've been trained into thinking in the last 5 years of the way, or 10 years of what technology has done with our currency that we have now and the way that everything works. If you take away some of those barriers, right now they look huge and monolithic and never going to move, but we've seen technology change several times. So these things could change, and if you just imagine for a bit further along in the chain of thought, you can think of things where every transaction is monetized. And I'm talking about a personal transaction. I'm talking about community, which is that's kind of the scarier side. I don't think that the mainstream will probably worry about that because they haven't worried about these types of things.
Well, but let's take a tangent there. Empire Avenue, which is I don't know if you've taken the time to use it yourself. It's too bad Daniel wasn't able to join us today because he's been doing a lot of research on it. Empire Avenue is this social network that's been around for several months. I tried it last year. And it does exactly that. It's a stock market. It takes Twitter, the social graph from Twitter, the social graph from Facebook, and it monetizes it. So it gives a value to each person in terms of them being a stock. Your stock pays dividends for each Facebook and social media update that you make. And as a website, it actually is, if you look at cloud as one that's taking a more social science perspective of giving you a score based on your influence, based on your authority, what Empire Avenue is doing is actually allowing your friends to buy and sell you, to speculate on what your future value is going to be as a communicator, as someone, right, who's, go ahead.
I'm just laughing at that comment.
Yeah.
Well, and Empire Avenue's been getting a lot of press lately because, as well, I think they got at least 7-figure, if not 8-figure investment, because they are creating, certainly amongst the people who are into it, who are interested in that type of buying and selling of social influence, in the measurement, in the ability to quantify what other these aspects are. But what strikes me fascinating about Bitcoin is where all of this is still virtual, where all of this is still like Empire Avenue is fake money. Bitcoin
only usable on the site.
Yeah, only usable within Empire Avenue. Like only, it's a virtual currency limited to the virtual
sure
world.
Someone's got a market trading Empire Avenue.
So here's the question: is Bitcoin the bridge? Is Bitcoin the currency that will unite virtual currencies? Is it the currency that will connect real world currencies backed by national governments with virtual currencies backed in virtual worlds? Because it's the one that people can trade and not have it tracked. Like, you don't know what the transaction is. You know the transaction takes place. Yeah. But there's no way to tell that you just traded Empire Avenue currency for US dollars. Or you just traded Canadian dollars for, World of Warcraft dollars.
Right. I think that's where the friction against Bitcoin is going to come in several stages. And then the first one's going to be these markets that will be traded. People are already getting caught trading Bitcoins for PayPal money. And PayPal is shutting them down. They've got an increasing number of staff that are dedicated to stopping this kind of thing. The reason for that is because PayPal is getting outside pressure. They are getting outside, and they realize it for themselves. If they want to continue to do online transactions and extract their 2.1 to 3% fee, which is their literal bread and butter, just like the credit card companies, they have to be in the good graces of the big banking and industry, normal economics or normal economy. If they fall afoul of that, they could see a lot of problems. And other outfits have, like Liberty Dollar, which is doing something not quite the same, but they got busted, literally. FBI showed up their door and took all their gear, kind of thing, and this guy's in court and he might go to jail. Governments don't like alternative currencies. You see, every government in the world has quite a lot of laws, and all the barter networks have very, very, very strict policies.
So, just for a moment, playing devil's advocate, could you see a scenario in which governments weren't threatened by Bitcoin, in which they saw it towards their benefit?
Yes, because of this tracking aspect of things, if they have enough listening devices all over the world, they can start seeing the minute and secret flows, which were previously not actually available to them, to see money flowing between large organizations. I mean, there's got to be huge drug dealers on Bitcoin, because you go on this site called Bitcoin Explorer and you can track coins. That's very, very boring. You see, 200-digit number A, which is actually compressed into base 58, so it looks like letters and numbers, like 1Y, lowercase b, c, 3, d, 0, it's just long, had transferred 200,000 Bitcoins to 5BX9.
And what would that be in US dollars?
Right now, today, I didn't look at the rate today, but in the last 2 days it was 850. 850 USD times 200,000. That's $1.6 million trade. Now, it could have been one guy consolidating his own accounts. That's easy. That's easy to think. Now, I was thinking, well, why is that not a transfer? Why don't we think of that as legitimate economic activity when you see all these transfers which people suspect?
Yeah, why do you assume that
it's like, well, geez, this guy transferred $200,000. Geez, that's kind of a lot of money. Well, number one, it's got to be like, who would put that much money into a system,
Bitcoins
right?
In the first place?
Black market, right? Now, who would trust someone enough to transfer that kind of money? I guess it's two very trustworthy people, or you trust yourself. That's what I was going to say. The reason you can transfer to yourself, we don't think is a big deal, is because there's no trust gap to bridge. And that's what Bitcoin has done with these computations. It has made a virtual currency that is generated by fiat. It has commodified the distrust between agents in the system. Now, most humans do that through other systems of friction and physical. Paper is another one, but now there's virtual and pseudonymous. It's not anonymous. I don't want to say it's anonymous. I want to say it's more pseudonymous.
Because it's still tied to a pseudonym.
Yeah, I mean, you can make as many as you want. When you have your Bitcoin wallet, you have an ID, an address, and people can send it. That's your unlocking key, and they can lock it with that key, and you can unlock it. You can have as many as you want, and it's actually a very good idea that you have one for every person you receive from. So when you get money to that account, you know who it came from, because it came to this account, not that one. So I have like 5 Bitcoin accounts, and they each have like a cent. And a friend he thought it was stupid and frustrating. He doesn't understand how currencies can be generated just by fiat without a government backing it. And of course, the answer to the conversation is, how does a government really back its currency? The answer now is bullets. It used to be gold, but that got, I think, taken apart in the 70s. And so he sent me all the Bitcoins he tried generating, which was, 1. So I have like 1 Bitcoin from him. I know I received it from him because it went to that address. But
hold on, what do you mean all the Bitcoins that he generated? Like,
he generated 1 Bitcoin.
So do you earn money just by being part of the P2P system? Like, you're contributing CPU cycles. You're contributing computational power. And in exchange for giving your computers time, do you then earn money as a result?
If you were joined to a pool. See, normally what you're doing is everybody's looking for the next lottery. There's an encrypted hash that goes out. Actually, I'm a little fuzzy on this because it is extraordinarily technical. But I still think that modern financial system that we have is more technical than that. And I don't actually understand it, but I still use Canadian dollars on the street. So people.
But
don't
in
have
the
to
case
necessarily
of existing financial systems, their complexity is trumped by their accessibility.
right.
The fact
And
that
the backing that
yeah,
that
the
the
fact that
government
you can get Canadian dollars anywhere, that anyone will accept it, that all banks will deal with it, is its power.
Right.
And it's the perceived value amongst all people, both of its accessibility and of its value, that makes it useful.
Is it always universally accessible? Let's take the USD. Is the USD always universally accessible? Can I always use USD to make a transaction?
In the U.S., yes.
Well, how about just, in the Western world, say to Europe?
But here
You know what I'm bringing up?
here's we're getting into transnational phenomena where you're transcending the nation state.
Well, that's part of the value of Bitcoin, right? Because it doesn't have any central government that's controlling it. So it's not tied to any one specific economy.
So it's invented for internet
Right.
transactions.
So what I'm going to say is, no one could pay WikiLeaks except for in Bitcoins. And I wish I got into Bitcoins back then. I almost looked at it deeply, and I kind of got distracted.
Because WikiLeaks has been cut off
of all other legitimate forms of funding. So that
Right.
makes it interesting. That means the governments are trying to show to their constituents that they're very powerful, and they're going to come down hard on someone who thwarts their interests. Meanwhile, when the person who's thwarting their interests is asking for some currency to support them, if you shut off the method of being able to pay them by the legitimate government's currencies, what are people going to do? They're going to use alternative currencies. So the government damaged itself, in all governments, damaged themselves, and the credit card companies. Because now all those kids in Anonymous who are, want to rebel against the system are like, screw credit cards, I'm not going to use them, I'm just going to use Bitcoin. Especially because a lot of these kids are into video games. And it turns out that all of the graphics processors on these computers for video games are very, very good at cracking the keys. Normal CPUs are no longer specialized and tuned well enough to do this very narrow type of work. And actually, you don't even need very much RAM on the thing, so they actually don't run as hot as normal. They're just using the little processing unit. And they're much faster than CPUs, about 10 times faster for the money, and for the power, actually. Because there's capital cost, and a good graphics card can be anywhere from $300 to $900. And then there's the power cost. So actually now Bitcoin is somewhat tangentially or nominally tied to the cost of power, because as people generate them...
Because you need electricity to use the currency. It's
right,
not printed on a piece of paper.
Right,
It's not an actual coin.
Well, I don't just mean that. I don't just mean, I can use a couple watts in my phone. It's very efficient to transfer Bitcoin, but to generate a Bitcoin, see, that's what the generation does of this computation. It bridges the trust gap of the fiat. Creating a currency by fiat, you have to have everybody agree that that new coin is worth one coin.
Right, and you have to regulate how new currency is introduced into the system.
Right, it's introduced by making it more and more difficult as the computation power of the network goes up. Sometimes it goes back down. As soon as the difficulty steps up one step, because it is a stepwise function.
Which, if an interesting analogy here, it's the same value of a social network, right? Like if you were someone on Twitter in the early days and you had a lot of followers, you might now be eclipsed by someone who came and used autofollow programs to get themselves many followers.
The guy who generated coins with the CPU.
Right, so that's why some startups will have controlled betas, will have controlled invites, because the value of the exclusivity, the value of who's there, has to be controlled by how they grow. Because if they grow too fast, then you get failure, then you get outage, and the value of a service as a whole diminishes.
Right. So the early adopters are very heavily rewarded in Bitcoin because they believed earlier on, because now I've heard about it, I've waited. I didn't look deeply enough into alternative media or whatever, didn't read Slashdot enough, or I get breathless enough about some new thing, because I've seen too many of them go by that turned out to be really nothing, to jump into it early. But other people got paid for their early adoption because Bitcoin started out at like 1/10 of a cent. Now they're worth $8.50. Some guy back in June of last year was talking about how he had calculated some either social or technical, of course he's not going to tell, attack on the Bitcoin network. Now everybody thinks it's kind of bullshit because nothing's happened yet. People have guessed at what he might have been doing, but he managed to generate 75,000 Bitcoins by using a lot of different computational power, which was cheap enough at the time. And he had investors. He talked about investors on the message board. He had other people throwing money, so they had to get a bunch of computers running. They rented computers out at co-location facilities, etc., etc. He has 75,000. That's quite a lot of money now, if you just let it sit in the bank. Especially if you cashed out 2 weeks ago, it was $9.30. So it's like a real money market. Now the one thing is that as more and more coins are generated, right now we're in a little bit of a bubble because the media is just...
Because there's so much interest in it.
So much interest in it. And people think that the coin is always going to deflate because it gets more valuable, unlike our currency, which is inflation. And I don't know very much about economic theory, but I'm starting to read about it because it's so germane to this. And all of our societal or economics in Western societies are centered around inflationary currencies, which means we have to consume to maintain our economy. If you don't consume, then you have a problem. And that's why our economies are so terrified. Our economists are terrified of deflation because it turns the system on its head, and we're not geared for it. Now, you can have a deflationary currency. It just means when you run a company, it has to be really extremely solid and providing value worth a little bit more, definitely more than its cost almost at all points. It also means that people supposedly will save their money because it'll just get more valuable. But the problem is you can't do that forever. Just as much as in a recession, we always climb out of them.
Well, and all of this...
You need to spend money.
All of this is based upon a scarcity, right? And the scarcity in this case is that computational resource.
Right. It's constructed scarcity. I won't even say it's false because it's not false. Everybody knows the rate at which coins are going to come out, and they're going to end in 2030 something.
Because the peer-to-peer system means that even if you introduce stronger computers, even if more people
the whole system will
added
adjust.
more computers, it would scale so that it maintains the
difficult. The 50 coins every 10 minutes and so there's going to be 21 million coins in 2038. Now the coins are divisible down to a quadrillionth. So even if the value of a coin inflated to $1,000 or $10,000, you could still everybody start talking about bit cents, or the guy who wrote the original papers, this guy named Satoshi. People refer to Satoshis instead of bitcoins, which is 100,000th of a bitcoin. Which isn't really a useful currency right now because it's like a 100th of a cent. But you know, when that inflates by, if it inflates by 100 times, I think we're in a bubble right now. And I think when the bubble is finished, what will happen is it will no longer be feasible to compute this stuff at home. You will have to have. I've already seen people do. I used to work in cluster computing, building clusters for universities to compute, protein folding and that kind of stuff. And we went through a lot of mistakes of building cooling systems and trying all this stuff. And I see these people doing it in their garages again, like a row of box fans.
And this comes down to those who are able to contribute so much generating power. Those who...
Well, anybody can.
And the reward of that is you're earning money.
Yeah, it's...
by contributing that computational power back into the system.
How hard is it to do?
Because I wasn't too clear about how that works exactly.
Sorry, say what's your question?
Well, so you can earn bitcoins
by throwing your computer. If you got a great graphics card. If you don't, now here's your delay.
But how does that work though? In terms of
Oh, it's dead easy now. Like the people who originally figured out how to do it, they were smart not to tell anyone because they'd be the only ones. Because if everybody starts doing it, the whole computation market goes up. Your relative. See, the way you generate bitcoins, the rate that you generate bitcoins is your computational contribution to the network. Literally, if you're a 1/1,000th. Then your chances of getting a coin, or your average payout, is going to be 1/1,000,000th of 50 coins every 10 minutes.
Right.
So you'll get 1/1,000,000th of 500
So
coins.
in order for it to be worth your while, you need to contribute a lot of computational muscle.
Right. So what some people do is, on average, if you left your computer running for a very, very long time, say this little laptop probably...
But let's use a better example. If you were a multinational, if you had 3 buildings and lots of offices, could you mandate as an IT policy that between 5 p.m. and 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., i.e. when all those computers are sitting alone doing nothing, could you create your own grid to start earning money at night via bitcoins?
Oh, people are already doing this without their supervisors knowing. People are doing this in schools. Now, most of them don't have great graphics cards because the graphics cards necessary are
because they're cheap PCs usually.
Well, they're for the cheap PCs at these places. Well, it doesn't even matter the speed of the PC. Is how many?
But do you foresee that happening in terms of a conscious strategy?
Yeah. A conscious strategy by a company. Well, I'm thinking about Intel. Right now they're using GPUs, which is the graphics. Now it used to be CPU, computer processing unit. Now it's GPUs, which are graphics processing units, are already 10 times more efficient per watt. Next thing is FPGA, which stands for floating point gate array. It's a tiny little computer, doesn't do very much, but you get like 256,000 of them on a board, and the board uses 50 watts of power. Now these GPUs that people use in their computers can run 500 watts, which is pretty hot if it's summer in your house. It's not a time to mine bitcoins. It increases your cost. In the winter, it's great because you can offset some of your heating costs.
Well, and overnight, when the electricity rate is the cheapest.
Right. Well, we don't have that yet, but it will be. And we're blessed actually in Canada. We have very cheap power because I hear about all these Europeans. They're twice as expensive for their power, and some markets in the U.S. So they can't.
So that's an economic advantage. So what if Canada as a whole said we're going to subsidize electricity rates for everyone who generates bitcoins at night and allows us to track it and tax it? Because it's economic activity. You're generating.
That would be brilliant. And Quebec would win because they have so much power. It would stop selling it to the U.S. because it's worth.
So is that okay? Here we're going crazy, but is that the source of Quebec sovereignty? they could say, not only do we have our own power, but we have power that with computational power can generate money.
There's too many militaries nearby. Though then again, Quebec has what, like half the military services?
So let's come back. Let's come back to an earlier issue around the tracking, where we talked about how one of the incentives around Bitcoin is that it makes visible, it makes measurable a whole bunch of economic activity that was otherwise untrackable.
Right.
And one of the benefits of Bitcoin is that tracking capability. We talked about how that might be a seller for governments in terms of why they would permit this to continue in spite of having no control over it.
I don't think they will, though.
But let's not speculate there because we don't know.
Well,
so until we have news that allows us to go that
very
route,
quickly, they'll say they don't want, they're totally against it, and surreptitiously already the CIA is having one of the guys who found it.
But again, that's speculative. Where I want to, if we're going to speculate, I'd much prefer to talk about applications than implications, because where applications of this tracking come into play are both around research, but the social analytics industry is huge, right? The people who've developed the technology to look at Twitter, to look at Facebook, and extract from that both insights in terms of what's going on, but also, as we were talking about with Cloud and with Empire Avenue and Greater.com is another, they try to give scores to people's activity, scores to people's influence. Could those same methodological approaches, could those same technologies be applied to Bitcoin, in that really what I'm asking is what information is available to be crunched? Like if all this is out there, what are the type of analytics that you could derive based on the data that's being generated by all these Bitcoin transactions?
Well, if you had, you can get a full feed of all Bitcoins if you're on the P2P network. You're exposed to your client.
But what could you learn from that feed? What's the intel that could be mined from that data?
As it is, it's not a lot. You can see the ebb and flow because you don't know where they're coming, where they're going to. You can just see the rates and the sizes of the transaction, the granularity of the transaction, like how big the transaction is. Is it $1 or is it 5 cents? Is it $200,000?
So what if, and here I'm getting a little, not so much sinister, but I think in anticipating what will happen, what if there's an online retailer, an online, let's say, virtual game, and it says, play with Bitcoins, sign in with your Facebook account. So A, they're doing Bitcoin transactions with you, and then B, they can correlate that Bitcoin activity with your social graph.
If you don't use multiple different addresses in your Bitcoin wallet.
Right, but nonetheless.
People won't.
Right, but even if they did, they'll have one of your Bitcoin addresses. They don't have your full picture of your economic activity. But they could take your social graph, apply it to the data stream that's coming from...
Yeah, for sure.
And so what could they then get? I mean, does that open a Pandora's box in terms of tracking what people are doing and how and why?
It depends. I mean, if you especially... I can see people, for example...
like this is the argument for why Facebook would tie Facebook credits to Bitcoin. Because every time someone would exchange a Facebook credit with a Bitcoin, Facebook would be able to take that Bitcoin ID, map it into their social graph, and all of a sudden have access to a whole new world.
Right, especially if you have retailers, and if you use the same Bitcoin address at a different retailer, now Facebook knows who that is.
Here's where Bitcoin, I think we can totally invert it. Where on the one hand, it's being presented as a revolutionary kind of cyberpunk alternative currency, which it is. But if it was accepted by the powers that be, it could easily be part of an internet economy in which everything you do is tracked. And everything you do is tied back to you. It almost really is the argument that it's in the interest of Facebook and Google to embrace Bitcoin wholesale.
Well, Google's trying to be big enough to do their own. But
right.
I don't think... It's not... The way to make a currency legitimate is to allow the black market to use it. There's no better way to make a currency legitimate. Because if you don't, then the black market will have no qualms about making their own currency, which is exactly what has happened.
So the argument is, who's going to win the race to build the globe's virtual currency? Google or the black market?
The problem is the whole bridging of trust, right? We don't have to do computation to exchange Canadian dollars because we just assume the trust is there. Now,
well, we do a socio-political calculation that the Canadian government has the economic resources to stand behind the currency we're using, but that's largely unconscious.
Right.
Like, we do it without thinking. It's just part of how we live in society.
Well, one of the major ways that you have to trust your government with your currency is if you can pay your taxes. and not get arrested for not paying for when you pay your taxes.
Oh, sorry, Louise has had her hand up, and we've been too busy going back and forth. Go ahead.
I'm wondering what the group felt that Facebook would look at this being highly competitive. This is what they're trying to do. So would they block this? Because they could.
Well, and I think that will be their first reaction. That you know, same with Google, that they will see this as competition, and that they will prevent and ban people from using this with any aspect of the applications that are both going to drive the currency usage on both platforms.
That's very dangerous, because if they prevent people from using it, it'll drive communications networks underground. Now, right now, anonymous communications networks are a little bit of a pain in the ass to use, and people will use them if Bitcoin is banned. But if you allow people to email Bitcoins through their Facebook, then people will use it. I mean, right now, Facebook already doesn't allow URLs for torrents. It filters your email, your private email. You cannot send a torrent link from one person to another, which is absolutely mind-blowing. People should be completely aghast at that. You know, if I want to talk to Jesse and mention, you know, hey, what about this idea of doing something illegal? There's a lot of illegal things that are patently stupid. I think there's one about not walking, having a lantern man in front of your car on Toronto streets. I mean, there's some laws that are absolutely stupid, all the way ranging to laws that we all agree with. Somewhere in there is your personal moralities in there. If you don't allow people to transfer knowledge, information privately on a system, people will avoid using it. So that's the problem. And when you're getting into social networking, because Bitcoin is a very, very extremely liquid currency, that is the one thing that has got advantage over everything. It is extraordinarily liquid. I can write my Bitcoin address, a bit of a pain in the ass, but I could memorize and write it down on a piece of paper and give it to Jesse, and of a coin, and he could take that coin and cash it if he wanted to. Now, that's not a great way to do it. I'd probably just find an app for my phone and transfer it to his phone privately, not over the cell network, not even through SMS, but just like Bluetooth or infrared or whatever, and transfer it. And that is the most incredibly liquid capital possible, and it can transfer around the network so fast, it's absolutely unbelievable. And that means it's going to be used for transactions that traditional currencies are not.
Do you have other thoughts or questions, Louise?
No, I'm just like trying to keep up with this. It's blowing my mind.
Now,
it's intense, isn't it?
It blew my mind. I've been doing cyberpunk, reading about this kind of stuff. Got to the point where I'm
decades.
Well, like 2 decades, and I'm or 2.5, 3 decades almost, and I'm more jaded than thou is I'm trying to pull myself back and go do stuff like gardening and biking instead of getting into all this hype. But even this thing is really, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. It's absolutely incredible. Actually, one thing that's kind of funny, if you think about what we've done, people are talking about the moral dilemma of this, and one guy had a great answer to it, and so I'll give you that answer in a second. The moral dilemma was, of course, being nerds in the channels who are developing these applications to the pooling application. For example, I'll talk about pooling very briefly, which is why it makes it social. Pooling is if you put your own computer on the network and calculate coins, you only have a small chance of getting one. You either get 50 or you get 0. Now, if you have 1/100 millionth of the computing power of the whole network, your chances are 1 in 100 million of getting $50. Now, if you'd rather get 5 cents, you join a pool, and everybody pools their efforts in, and the pools take different amounts. Some of them there's a little transaction fee sometimes.
It's like a gaming clan equivalent to currency speculation.
Right, in a gaming clan, everybody goes in with 30 guys, and they kill the big monster, and there's one item that comes out, and the clan figures out an equitable way to split people trade this and that and give each other
and
coins.
the experience points, too.
Right. But it also makes a social network of like tribalism and teams. Now, there's 5 really big pools out there. One of them, the one I joined, is you don't have a private address. Your address as your membership on the pool is your Bitcoin address that you get paid at, which is great because that means that all the internal financial auditing of how the pool is working is exposed to the world everywhere through the Bitcoin system, which is the most incredible open accounting system ever. Governments would love it, and the people who are members of the pool love it. And in the other pools, you have to sign up with a private username and address. And that's a problem because they can do you have to trust that they're going to do that transaction and send you your computation, not skim a little bit off the top, because they're calculating what your share was of their total power. You just
and that's where I could see organizations, if and when Bitcoin became legitimate, sort of seeing alternate fundraising means of pooling their computer resources to actually engage in their own types of pools. Yeah. Now, we're pretty much out of time, so I want to ask you one last question in terms of a sort of conclusion, and that goes to the rate of Bitcoin's growth. And I mean, a number of times you use the word bubble in terms of describing the type of attention that it's getting and your I assume implied assumption that that's going to fall off, that it'll sort of go back to a kind of obscurity. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me when we talked about sort of the challenge to Facebook and Google, let alone the Visa and MasterCard and some of the other major players who in themselves see the virtual currency game as them to be the bridge to unite all the different currencies. Can Bitcoin grow fast enough? Can it become normalized fast enough amongst users, especially internet users, so that it can't be blocked, so that it can't be pushed underground, but has to be legitimized and normalized as one of the competing currencies to unite all the others?
Well, obviously WikiLeaks accepted Bitcoins. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a publicly funded kind of activist charity group, they take law cases, landmark cases, and send lawyers, especially in case of a lot of the music industry piracy stuff. They accept Bitcoins, and they're a pretty well recognized
But
group.
both of those are really symbolic groups in that they're both really small in terms of...
And they're extremely on the edge of, advanced cyberpunk.
But in terms of speculating and projecting this type of growth, I mean, do you see it as possible? I mean, you look at the growth of Google, you look at the growth of Facebook.
I do, but I think that...
They're the leading contenders to build this type of system.
So, as the cartels, the drug cartels literally get more and more sophisticated because they have to and can. They're engineering submarines.
Because they have the profit motive to do so.
Yeah, they have submarines that the U.S. can't detect. They're making stealth coatings on submarines. It's unbelievable. And the U.S. government is just making sure that it's profitable for them by propping up their activities, propping up their profits with the war on drugs. Of course they're going to get into this. They have all the computing power. They're getting more and more technical. They have hackers, black hat hackers on staff. They pay exorbitant sums of money, but it's nothing to them. $1 million a year for these kids. And these guys are totally going to get on this. And there's already that little site, which seems very common, just like a little community drug site, which I think is very, very interesting because it doesn't have the nefarious quality. Just like porn was considered incredible evil and et cetera. Now it's a little bit much more accepted.
Almost as if the flip side of this is it'll normalize all illegal behavior. Just because it makes it accountable. It makes it visible. It makes it trackable, and therefore you're accounting for that.
Right, it's trackable, but it's not identifiable. I want to split that. You can track the whole transaction to a certain Bitcoin address. Now, if you suddenly tie that...
But I think a couple of times today we've talked about how it's identifiable using other sources of data.
It's fuzzy.
Which will always be available.
I foresee an overlaying, other separate overlaying systems that will come along and make it a lot harder. Definitely. So if the black market is going to use it, and they have the funds to push around that they need to push around, it's going to go. It's just going to go, for sure. As for the bubble, what's happening with the bubble right now is that it's just pushing all these kids to get their computer gaming cards and get like 10 computers, make enough coins to buy more computers, and keep on inflating the market because you can use the actual computers to generate coins to buy more computers.
So in the age of the tablets, it's sustaining the PC industry.
Certainly the graphics card, for sure. Already you can't get the old graphics card, which was the most efficient per watt. Kids don't even care about how much power there is anymore. They care about the efficiency because they got to pay for the power. The only thing that this is doing is it's quickly pushing the market to the point where GPUs will no longer be efficient enough to generate coins, even if you're on Quebec Hydro, unless you're an industrial power buyer, in which case your power could be 3 to 5 times cheaper.
Because you're getting a different rate.
If you have a sweetheart deal. So I can see some corruption in there where, why wouldn't Intel make a chip to do this is the next step. I talked about FPGAs for research generally recently. But also people could make their own specialized chips, and who wouldn't make the chip like that? But also the US government has their own chip factory. So they could put their computers, and people say they could try to attack the Bitcoin market. We don't even know if they're not attacking it right now.
All very fascinating stuff, and for an introduction to the subject, it certainly indicates that there's a lot more that we can get into.